In 2024, a peninsula not much wider than a motorway ranked as the fourth most expensive place to own land on Earth. Not fourth in England, fourth on the planet, behind New York, behind London, behind Tokyo, and nowhere else. A 4-bedroom bungalow here, not even 3,000 square feet, changed hands for £13.5 million. Per square foot, that is more than a penthouse in Hong Kong or a townhouse in London itself, in the range of a waterfront apartment in Monaco. The average asking price on this strip of Dorset sand now sits above £1.28 million, more than 3 times the figure for the rest of the country. Millionaires keep buying, and the sea keeps taking the shore out from under them, a little more with every winter tide. This is the story of how a sandbar became the most expensive postcode in Britain, and why the ground under all that money may not be there much longer. Chapter 1. The accident of sand. Before the money, there was only geography, and geography here was an accident. A tongue of sand, barely half a mile across at its narrowest point, reaches out from the Dorset coast and closes around a lagoon of nearly 10,000 acres, the second largest natural harbour on the planet. Poole Harbour did not choose this shape. The sea built it, grain by grain, over millennia, stacking dune upon dune until a barrier existed where none had been designed, no engineer consulted, no plan drawn. At the peninsula's southern tip, a chain ferry now hauls cars across the harbour mouth in under 4 minutes, a crossing that spares the driver a detour of 25 miles around the water, past Studland and up into the Purbeck Hills. That convenience would matter later to people who had not yet been born and money that had not yet arrived. In the beginning, there was nothing here worth crossing for. For most of its history, this strip of sand supported nothing at all. No houses, no roads, no families, only dunes shifting a few feet a year under the wind and marram grass holding what little ground there was against it. The one exception stood at the harbour mouth. A lifeboat house built of timber in 1865, its sole purpose to launch rescue craft into a channel that had drowned sailors for as long as anyone had kept record of the drownings. It was small, plain, and unheated. It was also, for the better part of a century, the only permanent structure this peninsula could claim. Not that the coast was empty of purpose. Long before the lifeboat house, before any thought of a road or a bungalow, this shoreline served a different economy entirely. One that answered to no customs officer and paid no tax to the Crown. Isaac Gulliver was a Wiltshire-born carpenter's son who had, by his mid-20s, abandoned respectable trade for a far more profitable one. Born in 1745, he built a fleet of 15 luggers and ran them past this exact stretch of coast. Ships, low and fast, loaded with French gin, Chinese silk, Flemish lace, and tea that had never once touched an English tax ledger. Contemporaries called him the king of the Dorset smugglers, not as flattery but as an accounting of territory. His network controlled the shoreline from Lymington in the east through the whole of Dorset to Torbay in the west. It was a real operation, with capital behind it, with routes mapped to the tide, with men on retainer up and down 100 miles of coast. And then, at the height of it, he simply stopped. Gulliver read the political weather correctly. He accepted a royal pardon, walked away from the trade while still solvent, and remade himself as a banker in Wimborne, a market town a few miles inland from the sand he had once used to move contraband. The wine business he built alongside it kept the money flowing, respectably now, through ledgers instead of luggers. By the time he died in 1822, the smuggler-turned-financier left an estate valued at £60,000, a fortune built first on evasion, then laundered, quite thoroughly, into respectability. The sand itself made no one rich, not yet. It sat through Gulliver's lifetime and beyond, valued by no one, claimed by no one in particular, a barrier island doing what barrier islands do, eroding a little, rebuilding a little, answering only to tide and storm and the slow arithmetic of erosion. That arrangement was about to end. Within a few decades of Gulliver's death, this coastline would acquire something it had never had before. An owner with money at stake, a title to defend, and a very particular plan for the sand. His name was Lord Wimborne, and when the storms came for his shoreline, he would decide, alone, whether a single shilling of his fortune was going towards stopping them. Chapter 2. The Auction. Through the 1890s, the storms did not relent. They came each winter with real appetite, chewing at the western spit, until whole shelves of dune collapsed into the harbour mouth overnight, and old watermen along the shore began to speak of a peninsula that, left alone, would not survive another generation. Lord Wimborne owned that peninsula. He also owned, by the clear evidence of his conduct, a settled conviction about what a landowner did and did not spend money on. Seawalls were costly, and the sand behind them yielded no rent, no crop, no return a ledger could recognise. He declined to pay for its defence. The storms took no notice of the refusal, and neither, in the end, did the harbour. What moved instead was the Poole Harbour Commissioners, a body with no sentimental stake in Lord Wimborne's fortune, and no particular wish to save it. Their interest lay a few hundred yards inland, in the deep water channel that ships used to reach the quays, a channel that erosion on the Sandbanks side was steadily choking with displaced sand. Protect the peninsula, and the channel stayed navigable. Let it wash away, and Poole's shipping trade silted up along with it. So the commissioners built a sea-wall, not as charity toward a peer who had refused to lift a finger, not as sympathy for a coastline nobody yet lived on, but as plain commercial defence of a harbour that moved cargo and collected dues. The wall held. The bill, however, still had to be paid by somebody, and the commissioners had no intention of absorbing it themselves, which brought them, in 1896, to an auction. The commissioners divided the newly protected land into 40 plots and sold them off, parcel by parcel, to recover what the wall had cost. It was a modest piece of civic bookkeeping conducted without ceremony, and it is also the exact moment Sandbanks changed from geography into property. Before that auction, the peninsula had been empty sand with an absentee owner attached to it. After it, 40 separate strangers held 40 separate deeds, each one a small rectangle of dune, with a price now permanently fixed to it. That was no longer a rumour of value. It was value entered on paper, sold to the highest bidder in a single afternoon. What those 40 buyers did with their purchase, however, made no claim to grandeur. They built shacks, timber-framed, single-storey, thrown up for the summer months and shuttered for the rest of the year. There were no made roads connecting one plot to the next, so a family visiting its neighbour walked across open dune to do it. There was no piped water, no drainage, no gas main crossing the harbour to reach them. Anything a household needed, it carried in by boat or handcart. This was not yet the fortune the peninsula would become. It was simply claimed sand, dotted with wooden huts, inhabited a few weeks a year by people who had bought cheaply into a place nobody else particularly wanted. Growth, when it came, would come slowly enough to test anyone's patience. A travel guide compiled in 1901, 5 years after the auction, recorded the entire private population of Sandbanks in a single short paragraph. A handful of houses, one hotel, one pier. Nothing more. Whatever Sandbanks would eventually become in the closing years of the 19th century, it remained by any honest count barely a hamlet. Chapter 3. Roads, a ferry, a pavilion. By 1911, the peninsula finally had roads in it. Cart tracks were metalled, footpaths through the gorse became surveyed lanes, and for the first time since the sands had settled into their present shape, a person could cross from the harbour side to the open sea without knowing the ground by heart. It was not much, a scattering of graded surfaces across 3 miles of scrub and dune, but it changed the arithmetic of the place. A peninsula that could be crossed could be built on. A peninsula that could be built on could, in time, be sold in parcels rather than leased in patches. The roads did not make Sandbanks anything yet. They only made it possible. The war that followed put the question aside, as wars tend to. But when it ended, something in the peninsula's fortunes shifted for good. Visitor numbers climbed, and this time they did not slide back the following season. Villas began to rise along the northwestern shore, facing the harbour rather than the exposed channel side. Solid, gabled, brick-built houses, put up by men who intended to keep coming back winter after winter. Unlike the packing crate shacks of the 1890s, patched together from ship's timber and tar paper, or the canvas tents pitched for a fortnight and struck again in September, these were houses built to last. A foundation, a chimney, an owner's name on the deed. The peninsula, however, remained an awkward place to reach. Poole lay across a stretch of water that no bridge spanned, and the road route around the harbour added miles to a journey that, by boat, took minutes. That changed in 1926, when the Sandbanks chain ferry began hauling its first vehicles across the harbour mouth on iron chains, dragged by a steam winch. 2 years later, in 1928, the pavilion opened at the top of the main beach, a long white building of tea rooms and changing cubicles, set squarely at the point where the road met the sand. Neither structure was large. Together, they did something no single Act of Parliament or private auction had managed in the previous half-century. They tied Sandbanks physically to Poole, on a schedule, for a fair every day of the year. The building followed the connection, not the other way round. By 1933, roughly 170 dwellings stood scattered across the peninsula. Bungalows mostly, holiday chalets, modest weatherboard houses built for August rather than for permanence. There was no mansion among them yet, no architect-designed statement facing the harbour, nothing that would have startled a visitor from Bournemouth or Weymouth. Sandbanks in 1933 was a place people came to for a fortnight, not a place people announced themselves through. The wealth that would eventually reshape the shoreline was still, for the moment, elsewhere, waiting, uncommitted on someone else's ledger. 6 years later, that quiet would end for reasons that had nothing to do with holidaymakers, ferries, or the price of a harbour view plot. A war was coming that would not delay Sandbanks the way the last one had. It would arrive on the peninsula itself. Chapter 4. The Peninsula at War. The peninsula that had spent 30 years selling seclusion to the rich now belonged to the war. In September 1939, the sand that had drawn honeymooners and stockbrokers became a defensive line, and the villas that had drawn architects became billets. The Sandbanks Hotel, barely 2 decades old, stopped serving afternoon tea and started serving engines. Its ballroom floor, built for dancing, took the weight of army lorries and armoured cars driven in for repair, and its function rooms filled with the smell of oil rather than orchids. Nobody had built the place to hold a workshop. It held one anyway. In every sense but name, the hotel had become a barracks. The Haven, standing at the harbour mouth where it had watched ferries come and go since 1885, took in the Green Howards first, then American troops passing through on their way to somewhere the men themselves were not told. Royal Navy personnel followed, and after them the flying crews of BOAC, the national airline whose civilian pilots now flew military routes out of a harbour that had never seen an aircraft before 1939. 4 uniforms under one roof, none of them paying guests, all of them waiting for orders that arrived by telephone rather than by post. Poole Harbour itself had changed shape. Where bathers had once counted the ferries crossing to Studland, the water now held Sunderlands and Catalinas, flying boats built to a scale the harbour had never hosted, each one the length of a house, and moored close enough to the shore that their engines could be heard from the beach at dawn. They sat low on the water, grey against grey, refuelled and rearmed and sent out over the channel on patrols that had nothing to do with pleasure, and everything to do with what was crossing it. The harbour that had made its name on yachts now measured its traffic in tons of aircraft. The beach told the same story in a different material. Where deck chairs had stood in rows below the pavilion, coils of barbed wire now ran the length of the shore. Staked into the sand at intervals, a soldier could walk in the dark. Concrete blocks, cast square and grey, sat where children had built their castles, spaced to stop a tank rather than a tide. The groins that had once marked out swimming areas for families now marked fields of fire. Sand that had been raked smooth for visitors was left churned by boots and wheels, and the tide line carried rope and rusted stakes instead of shells. Nobody who had bought a plot here in 1925 had pictured this. Nobody who built the pavilion for dancing had pictured it either. By the spring of 1940, the peninsula held more uniforms than deck chairs, and the harbour held more flying boats than yachts. The Green Howards drilled where golfers had once walked the fairway at the Sandbanks Hotel. American voices carried across a bar where retired colonels had once discussed the tide tables. And overhead, through that spring and into the summer, the aircraft kept coming and going on schedules nobody outside the base was told. Sandbanks had spent 30 years learning how to disappear behind hedges and gates. It had 2 years left before the war came looking for it from the air, and it would not need an invitation to arrive. Chapter 5. The Boiler in the Flowerbed. The bombing raid did not spare the argument that Sandbanks was too small, too quiet, too far from anything worth killing for. It hit the Sandbanks Hotel directly, and it hit the kitchen hardest of all. The room where the boiler lived bolted to the floor, doing the unglamorous work of heating water for guests who had mostly stopped arriving. The blast tore through brick and joist and lifted that boiler bodily out of the building, past the wall that had contained it, into the open air where a boiler has no business being. This was not damage in the ordinary sense, not the scorched curtain or the cracked window a hotel could apologise for and repaint. It was displacement. Several £100 of riveted iron travelling a distance no engineer had designed it to travel, coming to rest in what had been the morning before a flowerbed. Nobody measured the arc it made. Nobody needed to. The outline in the grass did the measuring on its own. There is a detail worth sitting with, plainly, without embellishment. The same peninsula that would one day command land prices among the highest in the country was, within living memory, a target a bomber aimed for on purpose. This was not a stray bomb nor a wrong turn over the coast. It was a deliberate objective, chosen because a harbour town on the water is a harbour town on the water, useful or not, regardless of what a surveyor would later decide it was worth. The war did not care what this sand would someday be worth. It cared only that Sandbanks was a strip of coastline with a name on a map, a harbour deep enough to matter, a hotel careless enough to keep its lights lit past curfew. The paperwork, if any survives, would have called it enemy action. History has settled on a plainer word: target. The guests who once complained about drafty corridors were, by then, long gone, and there was no one left to complain about the hole where a wall had been. 2 years is not a long time to go from being bombed to being useful for the opposite reason, but that is roughly the arithmetic here. By 1944, the same waters that had absorbed a direct hit became a staging ground for the largest seaborne invasion the war would produce. Landing craft and troop transports gathered in the harbour and along the coast off Sandbanks, riding at anchor in numbers the peninsula had never hosted and would not host again, waiting for a date fixed elsewhere by men who did not consult the residents. The engines idled for days. Then, one week in June, the order came, and the harbour emptied itself toward Normandy, hull after hull after hull, sliding past the same shoreline that had absorbed the boiler's fall. What was left behind was quieter than what had arrived, a strip of coast that had just watched from its own front garden an army leave for France, taking with it the last of the noise the war had brought. The war ended, as wars do, more quietly than it started. No single morning when Sandbanks could say it was over, only a slow withdrawal of blackout curtains and ration books and the particular tension of listening for engines overhead. What came after was not restoration, not the return of the pier crowds and picnic parties of 30 years before. It was arrival of a different kind, money that had never sat through a raid, never covered a hole where a hotel kitchen used to be, looking at a bomb-scarred peninsula and seeing, correctly as it turned out, an opportunity nobody else had noticed yet. It did not introduce itself immediately, and it did not hurry. It came first as a name on a solicitor's letter, then as a surveyor's bootprint in the sand, then as a fortune nobody local had made, the kind that does not announce itself until it already owns the view. Chapter 6. Millionaire's Row. The piece, when it came, did not empty Sandbanks. It refilled it. The chalets that had lined the shore since the 1900s, timber, tar-felted, held together as much by habit as by nail, survived the war only as a rumour of what the peninsula had once been. The old hotel, the one that had watched over the harbour mouth for 4 decades, was gone, reduced by a stray bomb to a foundation and a view. What replaced both in the years after 1945 was not rebuilding in the ordinary sense. It was resettlement by a different class of buyer entirely. The Wills family arrived among them, the name behind W.D. and H.O. Wills, the Bristol firm that had turned tobacco into one of the great industrial fortunes of the age. They were not the first cigarette money to reach the coast, and they would not be the last, but they were early enough and visible enough to set a pattern that outlived them. Where the shacks had stood, plots were bought whole, cleared, and built over with houses that did not need to announce their cost because the address already had. It was not old money, it was not landed money, the sort that had held Dorset's great estates for 3 centuries and treated the coast as scenery rather than asset. It was new money. Money made in factories, in shipping, in the boom industries of a Britain rebuilding itself. And it came to Sandbanks for the same reason it came to almost nowhere else in England. Because the peninsula was private, because the peninsula was awkward to reach, because a single road in and a chain ferry out meant a man could build a wall around his plot and mean it. The name stuck almost before anyone had agreed to use it. Millionaire's Row, coined presumably as a joke by someone standing on the pool side of the harbour, looking across at what had gone up where the fishing huts used to be. It was not a name the residents chose, it was a name everyone else gave them, and it survived because it never needed updating. It functioned less like a nickname than a valuation, repeated so often across so many years that it stopped describing the place and simply became its other name, the one estate agents would use in place of the postcode. The contrast did the work the name only confirmed. A few years earlier, the peninsula had been wooden shacks patched with roofing felt, a hotel reduced to rubble, a stretch of sand that drew day trippers and little else. Now it drew the men who had made fortunes out of the war and the industries that followed it, buying plots that were, by any reasonable measure, still cheap. Cheap because the ground had been bombed. Cheap because the land had not yet caught up with what was being built on it. That gap between the price of the ground and the wealth standing on it would not last. It would close and keep closing for the rest of the century. There was no single year when Sandbanks became expensive. There was only a slope, and the slope did not level off. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, through decades that saw England's other coastal resorts empty out and fade, the peninsula's land values climbed without pause, plot by plot, sale by sale, each transaction quietly resetting what the next one would cost. By the century's end, the figure attached to a single acre of that sand would no longer belong to the same conversation as the rest of Dorset. It would belong to a different list entirely. A ranking with a global reach, one that nobody standing among the bombed-out shacks in 1946 could have imagined their patch of coast would ever join. Chapter 7. The fourth most expensive place on Earth. By the early 2000s, the numbers had stopped inviting comparison to anywhere sensible. Estate agents compiling international rankings placed Sandbanks fourth among the most expensive residential addresses on Earth, behind only New York, London and Tokyo. Fourth. Not fourth in Britain, not fourth on the south coast, fourth on the planet, a spit of Dorset sand keeping company with the world's largest financial capitals. It was strange company for a headland that had spent most of its existence being sold off in small pieces, acre by acre, to whoever wanted a modest hut above the water. The climb had not stopped at some sensible local ceiling, the way property booms elsewhere eventually did. It had kept going until the sand needed no local frame of reference at all, only a global one. The peninsula that had opened the century as a scattering of bombed-out holiday shacks now belonged in the same sentence as Manhattan and the City of London, an arithmetic with no precedent anywhere else on the Dorset coast. Wealth of that order did not arrive alone, and it did not arrive quietly. Sandbanks drew not merely money, but a particular strain of famous money. The sporting elite, Redknapp, Botham, Souness. Harry Redknapp, the football manager, and his wife Sandra bought a house on the peninsula in 2001 and sold it in 2015, a profit of £4 million for 14 years of ownership. Ian Botham, the cricketer, bought a mansion of 24 rooms, then bought the house next door as well, not because he needed it, but because he did not want a neighbour. Graham Souness, another former football manager, settled on the same stretch of sand not long after. 3 names, 3 fortunes, 1 narrow strip of Dorset. And then there was the bungalow. 4 bedrooms. Nothing more, a modest house of the type that elsewhere in Dorset would draw a few £100,000 and a shrug from the estate agent showing it. On Sandbanks, at the market's absolute peak, that same 4-bedroom bungalow sold for £13.5 million. 2,909 square feet of floor space, which meant the price worked out to £4,640 for every single square foot of it. Of pebble-dashed wall and ordinary roofline, nothing grander than that. The number did not describe a house any longer. It described a postcode that had stopped behaving like real estate and started behaving like a currency, traded rather than lived in, priced rather than valued. The averages, stripped of any celebrity name attached to them, told the same story in flatter terms. Across the peninsula, the average asking price for a property reached £1,282,000, more than 3 times the national average of £378,000. Even after negotiation, after the usual retreat from an asking figure toward whatever a buyer would sign for, the average sold price settled near £965,000, a figure still running nearly 80% above the wider Poole and Bournemouth area that surrounded the peninsula on every landward side. Sandbanks was not merely expensive relative to the rest of the country, it was expensive relative to the towns touching its own boundary, as though the sand itself carried a premium that stopped precisely at the water. Photographs from the period show what the money bought beyond the price of the land itself. Private jetties reached from garden walls into the harbour, built to hold boats that rarely needed to leave the mooring to justify their cost. Hedges grew tall and dense along the peninsula's lanes, planted less for shelter from the wind than for privacy from the neighbours next door, each of whom had paid a comparable fortune for the same view. It was wealth of a particular quiet kind. Not the sort that announced itself in the street, but the sort that built a wall around itself and left the arithmetic to speak instead. And through all of it, the footballers, the cricketers, the bungalow that outpriced itself, the sea carried on exactly as it always had. Chapter 8. The same enemy. It still is. For all the money that has moved through Sandbanks since the war, the millionaires, the developers, the men who priced a bungalow like a small principality, the peninsula has never stopped fighting the argument Lord Wimborne lost to the water back in the 1890s. The sea does not read title deeds. It does not recognise a postcode as a reason to behave differently. It took land from a Victorian landowner who refused to build a road, and it is still taking land now from people who own private jets. Nothing about the money changes the argument. The argument was never with the owners, it was always with the coastline. This is not erosion in the abstract, the kind that fills a paragraph in a council report and is quietly forgotten by the next meeting. This is a boundary, and it is moving. Independent coastal monitoring puts the retreat at roughly 1 metre a year along parts of the spit, a number small enough to be invisible day to day and large enough, compounded, to be catastrophic. Not a rumour passed between beach hut owners. Not a worst-case model built to frighten a planning committee into action. A measurement, taken and repeated, that keeps returning the same answer. Run that meter forward and the arithmetic stops being abstract. Without continued intervention, the sea walls, the groins, the recycled sand pumped back onto the beach after every serious storm. Some assessments put the spit at risk of disappearing within 20 years, not eroding further. Disappearing. The sandbar that gives Sandbanks its name, the geological accident that made 4 miles of beach possible in the first place, is not a permanent feature of the map. It is a temporary arrangement the sea has allowed to stand, and the sea has never signed anything binding. There is a particular silence in that fact. 400 properties, a price per foot of coastline that rivals Monaco's, a postcode that outsells entire English towns, and underneath all of it, ground that is measurably, quantifiably leaving. Wealth does not slow a tide. It cannot be wired to a beach the way it can be wired to a solicitor's account. A cheque does not reattach sand to a spit that the North Sea and the Channel currents have already carried elsewhere. Money bought the view. It did not buy the shoreline permanence to go with it. So the people with the actual say over Sandbanks' future are no longer, strictly speaking, the people who own it. They are engineers. They are coastal planners with erosion models and budget lines, the ones who decide where the next rock armour goes, which section of dune gets replenished first, which stretch is quietly written off. The owners can build what they like behind the defences. They cannot build the defences themselves, not without permission, not without the sums the local authority controls. For the first time in this story, a fortune this size answers to somebody else's calendar. 20 years, that is the number now sitting underneath every valuation on the peninsula, whether the estate agents mention it or not. Chapter 9. The subscription. The 20 years did not stay an abstraction for long. Between 1995 and 2001, the Sandbanks Coast Protection Scheme translated that number into concrete and rock. 4 groins driven into the seabed at intervals along the peninsula, and roughly 1,200 square metres of dune rebuilt behind them, grain by trucked-in grain. It was not restoration in any sentimental sense. It was engineering, done to a shoreline that had never needed engineering before, because for the first time in its recorded history, it could no longer be trusted to hold its own shape. For a while, the groins worked the way sea defences generally work, by buying time rather than settling the argument. In the years since, a further £33 million in public money has gone toward dredging sand back onto the beaches and reinforcing the same structures the 1990s scheme first put in place. Not a one-off repair, then. An ongoing subscription, renewed on a coastline that had spent most of the 20th century behaving as though it required no maintenance at all. The residents who once measured their investment in bedrooms and sea views now measured it, increasingly, in cubic metres of imported sand. The next line of defence is still only a proposal, and a contested one. Planners and residents have spent recent seasons debating a 15-foot sea wall, a structure large enough to be visible from the water, engineered specifically to protect what the newspapers, without apparent irony, continue to call Britain's playground of the rich. The phrase survives every erosion report. It survives every planning objection. It is printed above photographs of exactly the ordinary grey defence works that no playground, rich or otherwise, was ever designed to need. What the seawall cannot yet defend against is arithmetic. Average prices on the peninsula fell by figures ranging from 3 to nearly 5% across 2023 and 2024, a retreat that would have been unthinkable to the developers of the 1960s, unthinkable to the fishermen who sold their strip of dune grass for a few £100 an acre. Sandbanks still holds its title as Britain's most expensive stretch of coastal address, a crown it has not surrendered even as the numbers beneath it soften. Which is one way of describing a market that has stopped rising and has not yet worked out how to fall. The houses themselves tell a quieter version of the same story. Many of the multi-million-pound properties along the peninsula's private roads stand empty for most of the year, bought not as homes but as positions, assets to be held, insured, occasionally photographed for a property supplement, rarely slept in. These were not neglected houses, nor abandoned ones, but curated absences, maintained at considerable expense in some of the most expensive square footage in the country. Lights off, gates locked, empty most of the year by design rather than misfortune. It is a peculiar vacancy, not decline, not yet, but a stillness that a defence scheme and a sea wall proposal cannot fully address, because the threat they were built to answer was never the only one facing the peninsula. There was always the question of what all that protected land was for once so few people were living on it. That question would have to wait its turn because a few miles inland, across the water that Sandbanks' own groins were built to hold back, Poole had spent these same years writing a very different balance sheet, one that the estate agent's brochures, understandably, never got around to mentioning. Chapter 10. What the ferry still crosses. A few miles inland in Poole itself, food bank referrals had been climbing steadily through the very years that Sandbanks kept breaking its own price records, year after year higher than the last. Each one logged a short drive from a beach where the land alone changed hands for 8 figures. The two facts shared a postcode. They did not share a sentence in the property brochures, and there was no reason they should have. A market report does not carry a civic conscience. It carries a valuation, and the valuation in most years went up. The peninsula itself had not moved. The chain ferry still ran every 20 minutes, the same short crossing it had offered since 1926. 4 vehicles and a scatter of foot passengers hauled across the harbour mouth on a cable that had been replaced more times than anyone kept count of. It was not a tourist novelty, it was working infrastructure, timetabled like a bus, used by delivery vans and school runs and the odd removals, lorry as often as by anyone in search of a view. The crossing took under 4 minutes. It remained a century on the fastest way onto Sandbanks, faster than the road that looped the long way round the harbour, faster than anything the intervening decades had thought to build instead. What had changed was the shore itself. Where wooden holiday shacks had once stood in loose rows above the tide line, there were now brick beach huts, uniform, insured, changing hands for sums that would once have bought the house behind them. Where a lifeboat house had stood since 1865, clinker-built, tar-black, a working shed for men who launched into weather nobody else would put to sea in. There was nothing of the kind left standing. In its place ran a line of engineered rock groins, granite blocks trucked in and set at intervals along the beach, holding sand that the sea would otherwise have taken somewhere else. The building was gone. The function had not entirely disappeared, only changed hands from timber and volunteers to stone and machinery, from rescue to defence. That shift was, in its way, the whole story compressed into 40 yards of beach, a lifeboat house replaced slowly by a seawall. Nobody had marked the transition with a plaque. Nobody walking the shore path today would necessarily know that anything had stood there at all before the groins did. There was a pattern to it, if anyone cared to lay the pieces end to end. The ferry ran because it always had, the huts sold because people wanted them, and somewhere on the other side of the harbour, the bank queues grew because wages had not kept pace with either. None of it required an opinion. It only required someone to write it down. Not that any of this settled the larger question, which was not about huts or ferries or the food parcels handed out a few miles up the road, but about the ground itself, the several hundred acres of reclaimed and shored-up sand that the whole peninsula sat on, and what it would take to keep it there. The groins held some of it. The dredgers, working the harbour mouth on a schedule few residents ever thought to ask about, redistributed the rest. Every so often, after a bad winter, lorries came down to the beach car parks and unloaded sand that had been somewhere else a season before, trucked in to replace what the tide had quietly taken back. It was routine work, done at a cost nobody published, on a stretch of coast that had never, in point of fact, stopped moving. That too was a fact that would want its turn. Chapter 11. The tide comes in anyway. The sand made no one rich, not yet. By the 20th century's later decades, it had become the opposite problem. Not too worthless to matter, but too valuable to lose. Further out, past the car parks and the sea walls, the work went on in a larger and more mechanical register than the lorries had suggested. Dredgers worked the offshore banks, drawing up sand from beds a mile or more from shore, and pumped it back onto the beaches through pipes laid along the sand like scaffolding. The process had a name: beach nourishment, and a budget line renewed every few years by whichever council or agency held the current responsibility. It was, in effect, the sea's own material, borrowed from one part of the coast and returned to another, at a cost that would have seemed absurd to anyone who had known this shingle spit before the 1850s. Then, the sand had barely been worth walking on. The storms had not stopped, of course. Nothing about the physics of the harbour mouth or the currents beyond it had changed since the sea nearly finished this peninsula before anyone thought to defend it. What had changed was the price of losing it. A metre of beach in most of Britain was a matter of local concern, if that. A metre of beach in Sandbanks sat beneath houses valued in the millions of pounds, and many of those houses stood empty for most of the year, kept warm and insured against a season that used them for perhaps 6 weeks. The sea did not know the difference, and the erosion that had once been left to run its course, silently, unrecorded, unopposed, was now met with pumps, permits, and public money. The sea had not become more dangerous. The sand had become more expensive. Little of that history showed on the surface. There was no plaque marking where Gulliver had run contraband past customs boats that never quite caught him. No marker where the first plots were auctioned off a bramble heath nobody wanted. No sign at the site of the shacks the fishermen once lived in before the money arrived and priced them out. The war had left its scars in the concrete of unused pillboxes, half buried now in dune grass, quietly leaking rust into the sand around them. Sandbanks had built forward over its own history, the way its beach rebuilt itself, grain replacing grain until the shape looked the same, though almost nothing under it did. It remained, by any measure that mattered to an estate agent, the most expensive stretch of sand in the country. A strip of land built by a storm and an auction, held together now by machinery, and destined on a timescale nobody in the property listings mentioned to be temporary anyway. At the harbour mouth, one of the old pillboxes still stands, half swallowed by the dune grass, its concrete gone the colour of wet slate. It is barely the height of a man, its guns slit no wider than a hand, and at low tide the light through that slit falls across sand groomed flat by machines that cost more each year than the war ever spent defending it. It was built to watch for an invasion that never came, and what it watches now is a shoreline defended, at greater expense, against nothing more hostile than the tide. The tide comes in anyway.